Well, Christine, thank you so much for being here on the Rising Beyond podcast today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to talk to your audience and to you about this topic.
Yeah, so you and I both work in similar worlds. So if you don't know Christine yet, she has a similar practice to me. And so we both work with child protection pretty frequently. You might call it child protection, Department of Human Services. There are other acronyms for it
Social
in different
services,
places.
time still.
Yeah. And so that is kind of what we're going to talk about today and how it might impact your family court case as well.
Yep.
So, Christine, can you give us just a quick overview of you're a therapist, you have to make a call. Something shows up in a session, you hear something, and we are mandated reporters, so we have to call.
Right. And I'll say that that is never a happy day for us because one, it means that we're concerned that a child's being hurt. And two, it can really potentially impact our relationship with the child, with the parents, our working relationship. And especially at the very beginning, it's just not a fun way to start things off. And it also can create ruptures later in the relationship between the therapist and the family when we are mandated to do that. But I really want to make sure, and I think most folks probably know this or will have this conversation with a therapist if a mandated report issue comes up, but we don't have a choice. It's not something we get to choose, right? It's determined by the law, and we can be held liable for not making reports when we should have.
Yeah.
So, and most recently, our mental health attorney shared that there was an update to legislation just this year that said that that obligation to make mandated reports is specific to information we learned during our work hours or in the context of our work. So before we had to be a mandated reporter no matter where we showed up in life and what was going on. And now it's specific to our work duties and environment and such. So that's a clarification and it's something new that's come up recently. So yeah, once we've determined that a report is needed, and for therapists who are not yet fully licensed, and even myself for being fully licensed, having done this work for a long time, I almost always seek consultation to make sure I'm not making that decision on my own. So it usually is something that's done in collaboration with another licensed therapist, or if the person's under supervision with their supervisor to say, does this meet the mandate? We also are provided with training by the state. It's a couple hours training and you get a certificate at the end to show that you answered the quiz appropriately to determine that you learned what falls under your mandate to report. So I just want people to know that we aren't just kind of making these decisions about making reports haphazardly. That's a very difficult and step-by-step process.
Yeah, we do something very similar. And in cases where it is not black and white, we are always, again, I've been doing this for a long time, and I am consistently having to consult with people just to make sure I'm not missing something, that I am following the, laws, and that I'm doing what's best for my families.
Absolutely. Yes. So, and families don't often get to see that side of things. So I think this is a great opportunity to just let us know, these are very thoughtful decisions on the part of any mandated reporter, because we know that it can bring some difficulty into people's lives, and it's not always what a family wants to have happen. So with that being said, we then place a phone call to whichever DHS hotline is appropriate. And there is a statewide number that we can call. So if we don't know which county to report to, then that statewide number helps us make that determination, typically based on the child's address and or more specifically where the abuse occurred. It kind of just depends on the situation. If we don't know for sure where the abuse occurred, or the child primarily lives in Arapahoe County, for example, but they happen to be at school and that was Douglas County, it would probably fall into Arapahoe County's jurisdiction, because that's where the child lives, and that's where they have to choose where to run the case out of. And everything, is different from county to county, as you know. So there's some overarching consistency, but the counties get to make decisions about how to run child protection in their particular county. So there can be nuances and differences between the counties. So I always advise families not to assume that things will go the same way if they were involved before, had a report.
Yeah.
It could look different if they're now in a different county.
Yeah, it's similar. Like you show up to the police department and people are like, what's going to happen? How is, Arvada PD going to respond? And I'm like, well, kind of depends who's there when you show up. And so there's a little bit, I think, a little bit more consistency than that within the counties. But sometimes who's showing up?
Yeah. Who is the person who took the call? And once that call is received and we have the information that we need to report or believe we need to report, that falls under our mandate. And then they also ask a series of additional questions that may have nothing to do with the reason that we called, but they're still asking those questions. And it's still our duty to make reports or share that information if asked at the initial phone call, because that is an exception to confidentiality. That is also, I think it's a federal law as well as a state law, that we are not bound by the same confidentiality restrictions when making mandated report. So we do not need to have a family's written permission to break confidentiality to comply with the law that requires we make the mandated report. And so at that point, then at least the way that this is handled in the counties that I primarily work in is that thankfully there was a change that the counties made several years ago. So when I was a caseworker 20 years ago or so, it was just a review of the information that was sent in, and maybe the caseworker would consult with their supervisor, and that's how they decided if they were going to accept the case for assessment or investigation or if they were going to screen it out. Now that is decided by a whole team called Red Team, and Red Team is made up of a number of different people within the county, and they look at every report that has come in within the last 24 hours, we'll say. I'm not sure exactly how they staff those, and they make a decision about, one, does this meet their criteria to be open for an investigation or an assessment? And those are two different paths that can happen, at least again, in the counties that I work in. An investigation is for things like domestic violence, sexual abuse, really serious physical injury, like broken bones, a child having broken bones or being, and that is automatically kind of an assessment, or an investigation route, where they're looking to make a determination about whether child abuse has occurred, which we'll get into what that looks like. But then there's this other option for assessment, which is that it's not necessarily, there still will be an outcome of a finding, but really the path is more about trying to assess what the needs are for the family. That happens in investigation too, but it's less focused on making a finding and more about what does this family need? And is there a way that we can get them additional resources that maybe doesn't require DHS's involvement? And some of that can be like if you have a family that maybe there was a report made because children are standing with parents, asking for money because they haven't been able to sustain their housing. Somebody might call that in, and that might be like, oh, let's try to get this family some housing resources and get them rehomed to avoid a child protection issue over a financial difficulty.
Yeah.
Well, yes. So that kind of the next steps after a mandated report is made. And mandated reporters also have the ability to call and follow up to find out whether the case will be assigned or not. We don't really get to have additional input at that point about what should happen because there's already been the decision made. But at least we can get some follow-up if needed on what's going to happen next, which can be really helpful if the report is going to create a safety issue for a victim, survivor, and or the children.
Yeah.
So safety plan with that.
Yeah. And I think that that's something where I feel like I'm in that gray area all the time because we are in that space of needing to potentially make these calls, these mandated hotline calls. And I know if maybe one of the parents, right, because they're going to reach out to parents of these kids.
Yeah.
And one of those parents is abusive, either a perpetrator of domestic violence, perpetrator of sexual abuse, perpetrator of. And so we're not talking about the neglect of finances or even some of the emotional neglect pieces. But we know when there's someone that is abusive, as a part of my audience's world, that is the scariest thing.
Yes.
For the protective parent and for the child, potentially for that abuser to know that they shared the secret.
Yeah.
And so we're in that space all the time. So us being able to, we legally had to be required to do the report. Us getting that information can be so ridiculously helpful so that we can help you prepare for what might be coming and a safety plan around those things. But there isn't that place where we can't report. So I think so many of us that work with domestic violence are really stuck in that space of like, gosh, we know this is potentially going to increase the threat to your safety. We legally have to call. So how do you work either with your clients or even just internally or with your clinicians on those things? Because it's a reality that we have to think about.
Yeah, that's such a great question. One thing that comes to mind right away is that as part of the report being made, they also will ask for the family's strengths and ask about any services that they are already receiving and ask about a rating system for safety. So in those situations, I do everything possible to highlight all the strengths of the non-offending parent to really help DHS see the big picture of like, yes, there was this issue and the non-offending parent is doing these things to be protective of their children when that's what's happening. I also always share this is a highly high-risk situation. This is, right, I share all that information so that if it gets assigned for further assessment and investigation, that the caseworker has all of that information from the get-go. So that's one way to try. And again, kind of like you were saying with the police department, it does matter a little bit on which caseworker shows up because they could have a lot of training, a lot of experience. They could be newer to their role. They could have, a lot of different factors that impact how they show up to interview the children and interview the accused person and the non-offending parent. And sometimes it's that there's a concern about both parents, and sometimes it's a concern that doesn't even really involve the parents, although for your audience, that's not likely the case. But either way, they will be reaching out to parents. But I've heard from workers that they do take into consideration if the reporting party is saying, hey, I'm very worried that this report is going to create a safety issue for the children, for the parent. I suggest that it happens in this way. They don't have to take our suggestion, but we certainly could say, I think that if you could reach out to the non-offending parent or the person who is not being reported as the perpetrator first to get some additional information and create a plan for safety and keep them informed that can happen, just depending on the circumstances.
Yeah, I think that that's something that back when I was trained initially, right, that it was like share as little information as possible to uphold confidentiality. And in working with this population, I have to go almost completely against that when I'm making these reports because that is an issue. And so, yeah, when they say, is there anything else you would like to share about this family? I'm like, yep. Here we go. Do you have time? You're going to write a novel right now because I want to make sure that they understand the ramifications of whatever might happen. If they screen it out, okay, there's actually ramifications to that too. And we're going to talk a little bit about what does this all mean? If it's seen as unfounded, that has huge ramifications. If they're going to open an ongoing case, that has ramifications. And so I just want them to understand from the get-go, here's the dynamic that you're walking into.
Yeah.
And yeah, they can listen or they cannot listen, but at least we have really tried as best we can to support our families.
Yeah, I really emphasize that in training that I do for the county departments regarding domestic violence is that just by you being involved as human services, there's increased risk for this family, for these children. So we have to start from the place of caseworkers really being aware that just their very presence in this dynamic now shifts some safety concerns for the family. And that the more that they can do to, mitigate that risk, the better chance that they're going to have of one being effective, which is their goal is to keep children safe. So, they can be more effective if they're aware of that and look for problem solving solutions to the safety issues that are going to be inherent in the fact that they're involved, even if it's just a phone call and now we're closing the case, that there are always ramifications for the victim and the children.
Yeah. Yep. And I wish in all the systems we work, if they kind of kept that at the forefront, like your involvement has consequences.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my goodness, people's lives would be so much better if that just, was how everyone showed up.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's right. Like that's a whole nother push right there. So let's talk about it. So let's say, if they screen it out, that means they're not even going to get in contact with you.
Yep.
As the parent.
The report was made and Red Team reviewed it and said this doesn't meet our criteria to open an investigation or assessment. Whether, we might feel differently. They have some criteria that they utilize to make that determination. And, we're baffled sometimes, for sure, about, wait, what? How does this not meet criteria? But we don't always get to know why. In fact, many times we don't know why they screen it out. We can ask, and sometimes they can share that information with us, and other times they won't share that information with us. But it does feel on this side of it, not knowing kind of what all, I haven't done Red Team myself, so I don't know what all the things are that they're looking at, but it can be frustrating too for us when we know there's a safety issue or feel very strongly there's a safety issue and it's screened out and we're baffled as to how or why that could happen.
Yeah.
So I think, again, at that point, the only good news for survivors is that nobody gets contacted. And therefore, yes, there's a report on file, but that can also contribute to if a future report is made.
Yeah.
Right. And it documents that there's been an ongoing issue.
Yep. So it's, the paper trail that survivors very often need. Granted, that paper trail can be used against you too in some regards, and we can talk about that. What are some of the other outcomes? So they do an assessment or they do an investigation.
Mm-hmm.
What are the coulds? Like these are the different possibilities in your case after they've done the investigation.
Yes. So the options really are that it's founded, unfounded, or inconclusive. So inconclusive essentially means they're not saying it did happen. They're not saying it didn't happen. They're saying we don't know. It's kind of we weren't able to get enough information to prove that it did or didn't happen, whatever the accusation is. Founded means we have enough information to make a finding that child abuse or neglect has occurred. And this is the person, they use a term called PRAN, person responsible for abuse or neglect, and that this is the PRAN of that abuse. And lastly is the unfounded, which is unfounded doesn't always mean that they don't believe you, right? Or that they aren't also suspicious that something is going on. But at that moment in time, there's not enough information to make a finding. And again, for us could be like, how is that even possible? Look at all the information. There's no way. We feel so strongly like this should have been open. This should be a finding. This should be moving on for ongoing services, right? And then none of that happens. And we're baffled as to why and how it didn't happen.
Yeah.
But I have
and that
workers saying it's unfounded, but this family is on our radar and we do have concerns. So sometimes it's like the next time that a report is made, the outcome could be different, but we can get into all of that too about when a bunch of reports come in and they all get unfounded and what that can do for certain.
Yeah. I wish that there wouldn't be like this dual, almost like the two words of like inconclusive, unfounded. I wish they were completely separate because I think, at least in my experience, the counties lean towards unfounded. That it's very rare in our cases where it's inconclusive. And what I wish the counties understood better is that language matters so much in a family court case.
Yeah.
Because what shows up, and y'all listening may have been like, yep, that happened in my case, is look, there were 2 calls made, 2 reports made that were both unfounded. That means that this parent that's being investigated, they're safe. They're actually not unsafe. And it gives the family court almost like the stamp of approval of like safety, when so many times that is not the case. And I feel like there is such a disconnect and everyone is so siloed, right? Child protection's over here. Family court, domestic relations court is over here. And they try as hard as possible, in my experience, to not work together. It's almost like they try way too hard to not work together, but because they're siloed, they just have that language. Look, unfounded.
Mm-hmm.
And so like, oh, that must mean safe.
That is also something that has always been a mystery to me, is in some cases I've heard the domestic relations court say, well, dependency and neglect is involved now, so we're going to default to them. But then the dependency and neglect court isn't. I mean, I do think somehow I think they can at least see information in their court system that I don't know what that system's called or how it works. So somehow they can look for the information, I think. And again, I'm basing this just on experience. I don't know the inner workings of domestic relations or dependency and neglect court outside of my experiences. But the other potential harm is that, as we know, even when there's a whisper of parental alienation, which is the defense / other side responding to allegations of abuse, they just whisper parental alienation, it feels like. And that becomes more of a focus of the case in domestic relations court oftentimes, than the abuse that was originally, reported and there is a concern about. And we know that there's some research out there that says only 2 to 3% of cases are actually false reports, like actually just people making up lies, essentially. And that the majority of the time that somebody is saying there's a concern of abuse, there is a real concern of abuse. But for many reasons, we don't have to go that bunny trail.
I know, I'm like, that's like 5 episodes. A mini-series.
But I think that's, to me, even not only like this person is safe, but then it calls into question, is this other person who's making reports of concerns of abuse alienating the other parent? And that becomes really, really hard to navigate in domestic relations court, at least historically. I think what I've seen anecdotally from the last 6 to 12 months, it seems like it's decreased a little bit. I mean, it was really, really bad prior to some of the new legislation that Moms Fight Back advocated and successfully got passed as it relates to parental alienation, which was last year, I think, 2024 maybe. And things have definitely calmed down a bit, as well as the requirements that CFIs and PREs do training on domestic violence. I think that has helped. I just want to shout out to Moms Fight Back. I am privileged enough to follow along their emails. I don't often respond and get involved, but I'm always keeping an eye on what they're doing, because they are this grassroots group of amazing moms that I think any person who is in a situation where they're feeling that their voice is not being heard as a non-offending parent and they have concerns of domestic violence or sexual abuse, that is an amazing way to advocate on a bigger scale and be in good company with other moms who have been in the same position in the past, so they can share some of their trials. But also they support each other. They show up at court and do court watch if they need to. They take on issues, right, to battle. And they have been successful in passing some legislation that's been incredibly important to protecting children.
Yeah. And if you're listening, you're not from here in Colorado, there is the National Safe Parents Organization, is nationwide, but they have state chapters. And so I don't know if they have all 50 states, but they have state chapters. And I feel like they just changed their names. So I'm probably going to botch this. But I believe it's the UK, they have Custody Peace, like Custody PEACE, like Custody Peace is their advocacy group, I believe. And if they just change their name, I'm so sorry. And I can find that out. But it is really important because there's a case here that's been publicized. It was in the news. Thank you to the Denver Gazette and ProPublica for doing all you do for us here. Yeah. Where this mama was basically told, if another child protection report comes in, we're removing the child from you. They have removed said child from this parent's care. And none of the reports were made by mom.
Mm.
They were made by pediatricians, by therapists, by school, by all of these other people, not just
Who are all
right?
mandated reporters.
Who are all mandated reporters. So this mama, and you might be in that situation, you can't be like, Sybil, don't report. And I legally have to report.
Right.
And so that's why I think I wanted Christine to come on. And Christine does a lot of trainings for her county's child protection on domestic violence specifically, because there is this, this parallel, and they overlap a lot of times, and it can cause such a problem in domestic relations court. And it feels like, again, because they're so siloed, there's not a lot that can happen in that regard. So we got to just put it out there, right? That this is what's going on, and this can happen. I wanted to switch because I talk about this sometimes. I think I have a podcast episode on this. I don't even know. But what can a protective parent do if their therapist, if the school, if whomever does call child protection, and there is going to be an assessment or an investigation? Because that, as a parent, can be the scariest moment, hearing that someone's called, or they just show up to your home, to your child's school, to do the investigation. What are some of the things that a protective parent can do to have a more collaborative experience with those doing the assessments that can continue protecting their child through this experience? What are some things that you've seen that have been really helpful for parents?
So a resource that we have in Colorado, but could be found by anyone, is there is something called the Practice Guide. And it is a guide that was written for DHS caseworkers on how to intervene when working with families experiencing domestic violence. In there are lots of questions that were provided. There's a ton of information. It was written for caseworkers, but it's also really helpful information for anyone who's working with the department to understand kind of, at least what the ideal way of engagement like, and some things to consider. So I would suggest looking at that guide and going to the section that is the interview for the person who's identified as the victim, and looking at some of the questions that they may ask. And even if they don't ask that exact question, they are typically going to ask questions that are somewhat related to those types of things, just to prepare. It always feels better to be prepared than put on the spot, because the thing that jumps into your mind in that moment might be like some little thing that really isn't the main issue, right? But so nervous that you're just like, this thing, because it just happened. And it's like, oh, actually, the bigger issue was the thing that happened a year ago. And then since then, I mean, it's so hard because, of course, you're going to be terrified and concerned and not sure how like your words are going to impact the outcome, right? And so you want to be really mindful. But if you can do some preparation to try to get yourself emotionally regulated so that when you're being asked those questions, you feel like you've been able to give a good summary. I like to say we want the newspaper headlines oftentimes, like, but we can't get into all the details in one meeting, or we're going to get stuck on one article when really there's 5 important articles that need to be highlighted. So start with your highlights of these are what the concerns are, and any ability that you have to stay away from disparaging the other parent outside of saying, I'm worried for this reason, right? But saying he's a deadbeat dad, or she's a lazy mom, or
he's a narcissist.
Right. Any of
that?
that?
I don't say those things.
No, because it doesn't help child protection. First of all, you're spending time talking about things that don't help them to have a case, have the information they need to make an accurate determination, number one. And number two, it makes it look like you're just this angry person towards, and a lot of times it's like, oh, they're in the middle of a contentious divorce and they're just so angry at each other that they're throwing out accusations. And that's another picture that can get painted. And so really what you want to be focused on is, what are the most important things I need this person to know about the concerns of this other parent when they are with my children? What safety issues, what risk are they creating for my kids? And anything else that you might want to say, take it to a friend before Write it out in your journal, talk to your therapist, try to vomit that up before you do your interview, because it just gets in the way of them being able to get the information that you really need them to have.
Yeah.
And first impressions matter. Child protection workers are people too. Judgments are being made from the get-go about the way you're showing up. And so being mindful of that, right or wrong, I'm not saying it's, the right.
Yeah, it just is.
It just is.
Yeah. And so if you are brand new, you have not listened to the Rise Me On podcast, or you haven't been in my world for a while, exactly what Christine is talking about, I talk about, and I call it like the rocks in a jar method. You have these large rocks, you have pebbles, and you have sand, and you have to fit it all into this jar. Survivors start with the sand. The sand is all the context and he never brings back the lunchbox, and he says these things, and then he's 15 minutes late every transition, and these things that one off look petty. But if we looked at the entire pattern, yes, we would be like, oh yeah, this is a pattern of, but you don't have that time with the caseworker. You don't have a week with them to explain every little thing. So we don't want to start with the sand, which is that context. We want to start with the rocks. So those are the headlines that Christine was talking about. Your top 3 or 4 largest concerns. So throw those in the jar first. Then you have your pebbles, which is your evidence of. Throw those in next. If there's time and you were asked, then you get to share context.
Yep.
But you don't get to share that context unless you were directly, or maybe they did open a case and you are going to be with them for a year.
Yep.
Down the line, it might be helpful to start sharing the patterns in that context, but not in the beginning. And so, yeah, I like that. Whatever makes sense to you, like those headlines, those key points, that's what we're sharing. And then if you're asked, then you get to share more of that context, because you have to show up. And it's so hard because you're showing up scared. You've had trauma from this scary person. If this case doesn't go well, it feels double scary.
Yep.
Right? So we see you, and we are hoping that the work Christine is doing with training people is that child protection workers will start to see you too.
Yeah. And feel free to use that resource, the practice guide. And when you do have again, not at the very beginning, but at some point you could say, I found this resource. I mean, it is on the Colorado Department of Human Services website. So it's not just something that, it has been vetted by CDHS as a tool for their workers. And so, there could be an opportunity to mention, and I came across this practice guide, and it's been really helpful for me to better understand child protection. And we want that resource out there as much as possible, because it really does not just help guide how to intervene with you as the person who's been abused, but also the person who's choosing to abuse. And that's the language we use in our training.
Yes.
The person choosing to abuse and the person who has been abused. So yeah, it can really shift, how they even interview the person who's being accused of being abusive or who has been abusive. Because one of the things that child protection is needing assistance with too is, how do I hold the person who's responsible for abuse accountable? And how do I ask them questions in a meaningful way that also helps us actually work with this person? The hope is that, first of all, successfully identify who's responsible for the abuse. And then next, let's try to build a working enough relationship that we can get some movement to decrease the risk and decrease the abuse that happens. I've heard my great partner in training who works with offenders of domestic violence say, sometimes the goal can't be to eliminate all the abuse. It is risk reduction. And that's a really sad reality. I hate every time he says it. I'm like, no, the goal is to stop this completely, right? But there may be people who are abusive who are not really capable, or at least not in the time frame of a child protection open case, of eliminating their abusive thoughts and behavior patterns. But if we can decrease risk to your children, we at least make some movement where it's less abusive or abusive in a way that doesn't cause as much harm. And I know that sounds terrible. I hate even saying
Yes.
it. Makes me ick, right? But that's just something important to put out there to think about, is that it's a lot of work to change patterns of behavior. And these are patterns of behavior for people who are abusive. It's their thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes that drive them to do what they do and respond to their children and their partner the way that they do. And shifting that is a lot of hard work. And if they are diagnosed with something like narcissistic personality disorder, that can be years and years of intensive therapeutic work to truly change. And most people don't commit to that.
Choose not to do that. Yeah. And I think and it's gross, but it is something that even in the family court realm and the child protection realm, that moral injury is showing up.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about it all the time. It happens for providers, right? That ick that we're like, gross. This emotional abuse and coercive control is cool, but at least he's not, smacking them.
Mm-hmm.
That feels horrible. And there are limitations of child protection, even how long they're allowed to be in your case, depending on, again, the level of case that you have. Is it 6 months? Is it ongoing? And so it can be a year. Was your child placed outside of the home, or they were placed with you? There's all these different roles, but there's these limitations that are a part of our system that now those take just as long to change, if not more, than, the individual person.
I want to circle back to what you just mentioned too, because I think everyone hears child protection and thinks they're going to come and take my kids.
Yep.
And I really want to emphasize, not that it makes it any less scary for child protection to be involved, but they honestly don't want to take your kids. And I'll tell you, it's not hopefully for the people who are doing
because they're like amazing humans,
yes. But the bigger picture is it's actually very costly to have children in foster care. And I don't care how callous your caseworker is, nobody likes to remove kids and put them into placement. It is horrifying to drive children to a place that they don't know, which they've done a huge emphasis on kinship care, which thank goodness.
Yeah. Yes.
Right. At least it's a person that the child knows. In the situation where that's not available, it is a stranger foster home. We call it stranger foster home, meaning that it's a stranger to the child. But just know that there are other steps that child protection can take to keep children in your care. And also, Sybil was talking about the length of time they're involved. Intake, if your case stays with an intake caseworker, that means that they have, I believe, 90 days to decide an outcome. And if they are not going to move your case to a permanency, that's the language at least used in the counties I work in, which means ongoing, an ongoing case, then it will close at that 90-day mark. And sometimes that happens without court involvement. So there's also court-involved CPS, which is the Dependency and Neglect Court. And it used to be called voluntary, but nobody volunteers to be involved with human.
Yeah.
So now they call it non-court involved cases, which is essentially you saying, in order to avoid becoming court involved, I am willing to comply with the issues, right, that child protection is concerned about and take the steps that they feel are necessary for me to not have a court-involved case, keep the children in my care. So it can look a lot of different ways. And the goal is honestly to be in compliance with national and federal guidelines. They don't want to take your kids. So if you can give them enough information to share how you can be protective, and yet still they need to have some oversight and involvement because you're worried about your children's safety in the other home, for example, if you're separated. And that just made me think about all the situations where you might still be with your partner in an abusive relationship and you're not separated, and child protection has to get involved and either remove your involvement. And that's another thing to navigate as far as safety.
Yep. Yeah. And I think that just knowing, like in Jefferson County where I work, they call it like early intervention services. And their goal is to get out of your world in 6 months. That's their goal. It's just get out of there within 6 months. And sometimes you'll say like 90 days. So yes, sometimes these cases, they'll come in, they'll do like 30 days and they're out. So I wish there was like this is exactly how it's going to go for you. there's not an exactly how it's going to go. We have ideas, but there's not an exactly.
So with DR court, it's like typically it goes this way, and then as soon as I tell somebody you might want to expect this and this, they do the exact opposite, right? You're like, oh, actually, or every once in a while, it's this big surprise of, wow, your judge is actually really has acknowledged the issues. You got a CFI that was able to clearly outline. Like, there's been some more instances of that recently.
Yeah.
In my world down here in Arapahoe and Douglas County, not all the time. There's still, issues, but we've seen some great CFI reports recently, and we hadn't seen that in a decade.
In ever. Yeah, we've got a handful now that we feel really comfortable with, where I'm like, okay, if these are on your list for, dad gives 3 choices, mom gives 3 choices. If these particular ones are on your list, we feel better that they're going to be able to identify the patterns.
Yes. Yep.
PREs are not there yet, everybody. And that's those because not everyone calls it a PRE, the parental responsibility evaluators. Those are the more expensive, longer term evals. Those are your $20,000 evals that you're going to have. We're still not feeling good about those here.
Correct. And please, again, I don't know across the nation exactly what it looks like, but in Colorado, please talk to your attorney before you jump to assuming you need a PRE, because a lot of times CFIs can do enough good work. And like Sybil's saying, we feel more confidence in the CFIs, and they're capped at $2,750 as the fee. They can't charge more than that, whereas PREs can determine whatever cost they feel is necessary. And
right.
And there's psychological testing. That's part of what the PRE is. So that can sometimes be, it's, they do the psychological testing, and it can have the outcome that you expect. Like, oh yes, this person has, XYZ mental health, the person who's being abusive. And still that doesn't really factor into the decisions that are made for parenting time, in my experience. It's kind of more just like, oh, we did the psychological testing.
Yeah.
Here's what mom looks like. Here's what dad looks like. But I've never seen in my time that I can think of a recommendation of like, because of this mental health concern, this person's ability to parent is limited or, impacted, at least not towards the person who's responsible for abuse. I do.
Yeah. I've seen it once where the perpetrator showed up in they were less sophisticated than the majority of my clients' ex-partners. They showed up and the judge was like, oh, holy shit. Like, yep, this is scary. This is a scary person. Once. And I recently did an episode on psych testing, because psych testing has nothing to do with your parenting capabilities.
Yeah.
Like, that's not what they're assessing at all. And so it bothers me even that they would think to use that to make parenting decisions.
Right.
Ugh.
And like I said, you could have somebody who has a picture, again, like narcissists, they'll say something, they also kind of get kind of vague, right, with the reporting of the outcomes, like
some characteristics of.
Exactly. And still, from my experience, doesn't factor into like, therefore, this person's parenting may look like this for the children. It just kind of gets in the report, but it doesn't, unless, like I said, I feel like it has been used to harm victims more than anything.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I feel like there's so many ways and pieces of this conversation that we could continue and continue and continue.
Yeah.
But I feel like we've given people a good, just like, this is kind of a basic understanding of, and how, if it shows up in your case, how you can be more prepared for what's coming.
Yes. That's the other piece, right? Like, you as a parent, you have no experience with this. You've never been involved with child protection. At least, when you're connected to a therapist like Sybil or I or our teams, we can at least guide some of, here's what you might expect next. Here's what this term means. Right. But for parents that don't have that, it's really a very, like anything, even anything I would be involved in that I'm familiar with, right? You can't see what's happening because you don't have all the information and all the, So I would say, whenever possible, try to get connected to somebody who does understand that system and can help you navigate it. And you should be getting a court-appointed attorney unless financially you do not qualify. But sometimes they can be pretty overwhelmed with their cases and may not, or you may not
have like the amount of
time.
time. Yeah. Information can be power. It can be overwhelming, but it can also be really powerful and helpful. So,
yes.
Christine, thank you for being here with us. If you are in Colorado, because we are limited of who we can support and help in a therapeutic capacity, but if you're in Colorado, can you share how someone can get in touch with you?
Yes. So Children's Wellness Center of Colorado is my practice, and we primarily serve Arapahoe and Douglas County. And do you want me to say the information, or is it easier to just post?
I will put it all in the show notes for sure. So we will have it there. We'll have it there. But I just wanted to let you know is, very often, if we're full or we don't have a therapist that's a great fit and transportation or driving is not a concern for the family, that Christine is where I refer to because she gets it. And we are always collaborating on these kinds of things. So if you are not in my area, you're in Colorado, that,
I like to
is
say
a place to go.
Sybil is if you're up north and we're for if you're down south.
Yeah. So hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully it wasn't too overwhelming. And if you have questions, you can always reach out to me, info@risingbeyondpc.com. And we'll catch you on the next episode of the Rising Beyond podcast.
Thanks, Sybil.